Russia's invasion of Ukraine has interrupted vital supply chains and driven up prices, contributing to what the UN's food chief calls a perfect storm within a perfect storm. The World Food Program warns that 50 million people are teetering on the edge of famine. I spoke with its executive director, David Beasley, when he was in Ottawa this past week. Here's the first part of that conversation. Mr. Beasley, nice to see you. Thank you for making the time for us. Appreciate it. You have warned that 345 million people are facing starvation. You've identified these 19 hunger hotspots, you call them, in the world. Could you just maybe start by describing the moment we are in the world right now and how serious it is?
In December of 2021, I delivered the Nobel Peace Prize speech, and I said that 2022 would be the worst humanitarian year since World War II. And just when you think it cannot get any worse, that was before Ukraine.
Yeah.
Ukraine, the breadbasket of the world, grows enough food to feed 400 million people, all of a sudden it's taken off the table. That was on top of COVID, the economic ripple effect that placed upon the poorest of the poor around the world, with climate shocks around the world and conflict. We've gone from 80 million people marching to starvation 5 years ago to 135 million right before COVID. Then COVID comes along, it goes to 276. Then Ukraine comes along, and now it's 345 million people who don't know where their next meal is coming from. And the troubling number is within that. Within that 345 million people are 50 million people who are knocking on famine's door in 45 countries. If we don't reach those people, you will have mass starvation. You will have, number two, destabilization of many nations.
Yeah.
And number three, you will have mass migration. And the cost of those will be 1,000 times more than it is if we get in there early and help the people early on.
What is the most significant contributor to this problem right now? Is it climate change, which seems to be pushing people around the world and rendering them homeless in many cases, or is it conflict?
It's both.
Okay.
I would have said 5 years ago, conflict, but now climate is another major factor.
Sure.
Last year, for example, more people were displaced because of climate than because of conflict.
Yeah.
That has never happened before. And that's not an anomaly. I do believe that's a sign of a trend that we're going to see. And if we don't prepare and give people the tools they need to overcome these shocks, well, you're going to have a lot of problems out there.
Yeah. You've traveled a lot in the past couple of months, I guess. We were talking before. What is something that sticks with you in terms of someone or a family or a group that was suffering?
I was in Somalia, in the Somaliland region of Ethiopia and northern Kenya, where you have incredibly devastating droughts back to back. I saw dead livestock everywhere, women brokenhearted. I had women coming to me, I've never received aid in my life. I've always been able to take care of my family. We have no water at all. And when you see their pots and pans now sold into the market, for an African woman, that's their pride because they like to feed their children. When they have to sell their pots and pans because they have nothing left and they've lost their livelihood because their livestock's dead, they're broken. And so we've got to respond. And if we don't, you'll have migration, but you'll also have extremist groups like Al-Shabaab and ISIS and Al-Qaeda will exploit and recruit.
Yeah.
I've had more women tell me, my husband or my son did not want to join ISIS or Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda, but we had no food. And we hadn't fed our little girl in 2 weeks. Mr. Beasley, what were we supposed to do? So if we're there, it pays for itself in a big, big way.
I want to ask a couple of questions about Russia and Ukraine. More ships left Ukraine this week. How did you get to negotiate that reopening of the port? What is it like to deal with someone like Sergei Lavrov, who has an agenda, and you're trying to save people from dying from hunger?
Well, when Russia invaded Ukraine, everybody was focused on the war, right? The invasion. I immediately realized if you don't get those ports open, we're going to have a global food crisis.
Yep.
So I immediately went down to Odessa, jumping up and down to the world, and I messaged to Putin, do you want to bring famine to the rest of the world? If you don't, open up this port. Trying to create a window of opportunity for Russia to show the world that, you know, while right or wrong, wrong in our opinion, of course, on the Ukraine invasion, we've got to get the grain out of Ukraine moving. And so we did a lot. We got countries, because countries all over the world depend upon 50% of our operations, of our food, was coming from Ukraine. And we just feed 130 million people. Imagine nations that depend 50% or more on Ukraine, Russian food and or fertilizer. And so African leaders began to speak out. We've got to have this grain. And I think the pressure that was brought to bear and very practical conversations with Lavrov is that, look, this has to happen. We must move these grains. Of course, he responded that, but we've got to move the Russian fertilizer, which I said, I understand. And so we had very practical discussions from the United Nations stepping up and truly bringing everyone that was necessary to the table. And there was a lot of give and take, and we've had a breakthrough. But it's still very fragile. And now I'm extremely worried about the movement of fertilizer.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. Yeah, so is anything moving forward on that front?
Very difficult. With sanctions and everything. We've got exemptions, and everyone's agreed that food and fertilizer should be exempt for obvious reasons. What people don't realize is that 7.7 something billion people on Earth eat every day. Half of that food is because of fertilizer. Fertilizer is a big, big issue. And right now, because fertilizer is based upon gas and fuel, right? And so gas prices are so high, fertilizer plants are shutting down. We've got droughts all over the world right now. People can't get fertilizer. Russia exports more fertilizer than any country on the continent. So whether you hate or love Russia, the point is we got to get Russian fertilizer moving. And so we're working, the Americans are providing the exemptions, the United States, clarity to move the fertilizer. Europe is still working on it. Headway's being made, but more headway has to take place. Because it's not a matter of let's get the fertilizer moving next year.
It's now.
Oh, you've got rice planted right now in Asia, and if it doesn't get the fertilizer in the next 4 to 6 weeks, what we're facing right now is a pricing problem, which is critical. Next year, we don't get that fertilizer out there with everything we're facing, particularly with the droughts, you're going to have a food availability problem in 2023, unlike anything we've ever seen in our lifetime. So we've got to get the fertilizers moving.
And the pressure there is not on Russia. The pressure is on other countries to allow this exemption to go forward.
That's right. Quit playing politics. People, it's not Russia that's going to suffer from the lack of fertilizer getting out. It's going to be the rest of the world.
I know you met with Minister Sajjan. What more would you like to see from Canada in terms of contributions, but also are there things that this country could be doing to deal with some of the things you were just talking about, fertilizer and grain, for instance?
Well, you know, Canada has been amazing stepping up. Literally, Canada understands if it doesn't step up, then taxpayers are going to have to pay more money in other ways. I can just give you anecdotal evidence of that as I've been talking to members of the Parliament from the left and the right. I can feed, for example, a Guatemalan in Guatemala, for a child in a resilience program for about $2 a week. If that child ends up at the border of the United States border in a children's shelter, it's $4,000 a week. What do you think the taxpayer would rather do? $2? Keep the person at home who wants to be at home, or stuck in a shelter at $4,000? Those are your options. It's not a plan C, do nothing, because migration takes place and you're going to have to pay one way or the other. So Canada has been fantastic, stepping up and helping, number one. Number two, giving us what I call flexible funding, so that we're not stuck in a silo where you can't do it this way, you can't do it that way, because some of the problems we run into need the flexibility on the ground to be able to meet the needs of the people so they don't have to migrate and they can take care of themselves. Number three, Canada's been a great voice in pushing forward less protectionism and better trade practices, things like that, obviously stepping up more financially. And so Canada's a model for other countries to look at and say, hey, how do we do it better? Because in the next few years, there's not going to be enough money for every humanitarian program on the planet. There's just not. With the COVID economic ripple effect, the debt crisis taking place around the world because of COVID and other factors, we've got to prioritize. And Canada is prioritizing. I say it's like the Titanic ship. You've got icebergs out front, and you've got a broken tea glass in the ballroom. It's not that the broken tea glass doesn't matter. It's just right now with limited funds, we got to make certain we don't hit the icebergs. And food security is an iceberg.
Well, that's where I want to end. What is the sort of reality for food security going forward? And do you think that people are, because of all the things that you've just mentioned, other things people are thinking about, are still focusing enough on the issue of food security and the fact that it could come back to hit you personally?
You know, I was hard on a lot of my media friends the last couple of years. I said, you know, you turn on the television, it was Trump, 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 Trump. I don't know whether you like or hate the guy. I mean, look, people are dying out there for starvation and war and conflict and climate. We need that coverage, and this is why it's so powerful to talk to people like we're doing right now, because when people hear that other people are struggling, their heart is moved, and they're like, how can we help? And as I say, look, if you're not going to do it out of the goodness of your heart, then you better do it out of your national security interest or your financial interest, because it's going to cost you 1,000 times more. And so what we're facing right now is unprecedented perfect storm within a perfect storm. The economic factors now, right on the back of COVID, where people have lost their coping capacity in these poor countries, this is much worse. And if we have a food availability problem, it's going to be hell on earth in 2023. It's avoidable. Food is the solution. And we got to act. And we got to act now.
Okay. Mr. Beasley, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rosie.